other reason.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
John, I
All
just
right.
spoke with him and he said he'll be joining us in just a couple minutes.
All right. Great.
So all those who have already entered the meeting, please be mindful of while we get set up.
All right. So finally, my internet connection came back to normal. I feel comfortable to speak.
I think we have about 60 or maybe 40, I think maybe 50, I take that back, people joining today.
Okay. Mhm. So Marcus will introduce him, or who's gonna, so we don't know yet, right? Okay.
John, I'm gonna email you something just in case.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna do it through the chat.
Hey guys.
Thanks for coming back, Charlie. I feel like my internet connection is now normal.
Just in time, huh?
Yeah, just time when I don't have to speak.
Howdy, everybody.
Hi, Marcus, I just sent you something through the chat as well.
All right.
Hi, Marcus. Are you introducing Dr. Thornburg?
Yeah.
Good. Mhm.
I just spoke to him and he said that he'd be joining in just a few minutes.
Mhm.
And then
Unless Pat's on board. Is Pat on?
I believe I just saw his cell phone join.
That phone, yes. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Do you want to do the introduction or would you like me to do that?
Yeah, I know it's been a while. Would you please? Thanks.
Sure.
So Rochelle, do you want me to start sharing the slide and then after introducing him, then switch to his PowerPoint deck? Is that what you want to do?
Yes.
Okay.
I think he is just joining now.
Mhm.
All right. And we'll. All right, Dr. Thornburg, looks like you're on board with us. Can you hear me okay?
Mute. As always, you have to do the unmute.
There you go.
The infamous unmute. But at least I didn't sit there moving my mouth for 10 minutes before I realized it. So.
All right. Well, hey, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here and to glean a little bit about your insight into this group. As we've talked about before, this group is the leadership group of the Construction Management Advisory Council at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And one of the things that we thought we would do today is just get your feedback. And we've got about an hour for a presentation, about a half an hour for Q&A. But it's an opportunity for everybody to get some insight into, where the current guidance is from your standpoint on where things are going. So
Marcus, really quick, Dr. Thornburg, for your presentation, do you have any audio or anything that you'd be sharing? Okay.
Just good old PowerPoint.
All right. Want to just confirm that before. All right. Apologies, Marcus.
Okay. That's
I
okay.
believe we are all set up now.
I'm I'm going to read a quick bio just because it's, number one, it's impressive, and I appreciate you being here, Dr. Thornburg. But for everybody's benefit, Dr. Thornburg founded Beacon Economics in 2016, and under his leadership, the firm has become one of the most respected research organizations in California, serving public and private sector clients across the U.S. In 2015, Dr. Thornburg also became director of the UC Riverside School of Business for Economics, Forecasting, and Development, and an adjunct professor at the school. He's an expert in economic and revenue forecasting, regional economics, economic policy, and labor and real estate markets. So this kind of gives you some insight into some of the questions you may want to ask him as you move forward. But given what I just told you, everything's fair game, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
He's consulted for
Except for the vote count in Georgia. I will not comment on the vote count in Georgia.
All right, so Pennsylvania's open, but not Georgia.
Pennsylvania's open, but not
All right.
Georgia.
Good. Thanks for that clarification.
All right.
Right. So obviously through this work, he's consulted for private industry, counties, cities, and public agencies, and become nationally renowned for forecasting the subprime mortgage market crash that began in 2007, and was one of the few economists on record to predict the global economic recession that followed. So, hey, we're looking for some big guidance from you here today. And
I appreciate that, and I'm going to do my best. And we have 90 minutes, which is a lot of fun.
Yep.
So let's go ahead, and I'm going to share my screen, get these slides up for you. And let me start out by saying a pleasure to be here and meet everybody. For those who I haven't met before, nice to meet you for the first time. I do typically wear a dress shirt, but I'm a little gimpy. Had some arm surgery early in the week, and I can't get a dress shirt on. So ergo, I put on my nicest t-shirt. But that to one side, obviously we're here to talk about the economy, which is intriguing given, of course, that the chaos of the election this particular week, which we'll come back to a little bit later as I get into this. First, let's just get into, obviously, the pandemic recession that we're in the middle of. And, you know, I'll tell you, you can go back in time and look at some of the newspaper clips from late 2006, early 2007. I was talking about a real estate recession. I was one of the few guys out there on record. I would love to tell you I predicted this thing. Nobody predicted this thing. This truly came out of left field. Obviously, in February, when we first started worrying about the pandemic, the potential impact of the pandemic on the economy, we already had cases. We already had cases in San Francisco. We have people dying from this disease, as we now know. Truly unique situation, totally unanticipated, yet, of course, has created really, obviously, a tremendous economic upheaval, I guess would be the way to put it. Now, we all know about the pandemic itself. I'm sure you, like I, are flooded with information on this on a day-to-day basis. It almost seems as if there's an almost the press seems to be almost too happy to every single day update the numbers of people who caught this, number of people who passed. And in many ways, obviously, my heart, I'm sure everybody on this call, everybody's hearts go out to the families who've lost loved ones or have had family members who were hurt by this thing. But the question, of course, here that we're talking about is what about the economy? What about real estate markets? And I'll tell you that this thing has been truly, what's the word I'm looking for here? That some of the numbers that we've seen over the course of the last 4 or 5 months have been truly eye-popping. I guess that's the only way you put it. You know, record after record. We've never seen the economy move like it has before. And a lot of this, of course, has to do, again, with how unique and different this business cycle was. And again, it's scary numbers at some level, but you take, for example, from the fourth quarter of last year to the second quarter of this year, you saw 11% decline in real GDP. Put some context around that. In the Great Recession, which was the worst downturn in the post-World War II period, the overall economy contracted by about 6% from peak to trough. But as I've been trying to tell everybody, right from the get-go is that as awe-inspiring as these numbers are at some level, you cannot compare these numbers to past business cycles because it is a truly unique event that our economy is working with right now. Thus, the lessons of the path simply don't apply. Now, that, of course, gets into really the big debate that's been going on about where the economy heads from here, the U or V or whatever debate. In the beginning of this thing, there was all sorts of clever, square root signs and Nike swooshes and what else do you got out there? You have, W's and L's and who knows what, right? But really it boils down to two camps. The majority of the U folks who have been said that this is going to be a long, painful situation. Folks are using terms like depression to describe what's going on right now. And then those of us, including myself and Beacon Economics, who've been in the V camp, where while we acknowledge obviously the severity of this situation, again, the losses of life, the 250,000 people who passed here in the United States, but it doesn't have, if you will, any of the sustaining characteristics of a typical business cycle. What we have been saying right from the get-go is a V is the only logical outcome. That is to say, we're going to bounce back quickly as we continue to get used to this virus. Now, here we are in November. We're past the election. We got our Q3 numbers. We just got our October employment numbers this morning. Lots of information is coming in. And I can tell you that our V outlook has been largely held up in the data. Indeed, when you get a little deeper into it, I can tell you that the recession, while this was the deepest recession in US economic history, it was also the shortest. A recession is peak to trough. Peak of economic activity, the trough of economic activity. The peak was in February, the trough was in April. So yes, deepest recession in US economic history, only 2 months long. Since April, we've been in recovery mode, and there's different stages of recovery. I like to say we're pretty much through stage one. We got a ways to go on stage two, but stage three is in the bag. We'll come back to that again a little bit later. For me, the real risks are the risks coming out of excessive monetary and fiscal intervention in the economy. It's not a short-run situation you should be worried about. It's the consequences of our inability to have candid, frank, and realistic conversations about the economy that have in turn led to excessive reaction on the part of Congress and the Federal Reserve, which could in many ways be seeding the next downturn in our economy. So a lot to talk about, obviously. Let's go through this. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the real estate markets as well. But again, start out with that U camp, right? And here's some of the headlines I've grabbed over the last few months. Worst downturn since the Great Depression. Will scar the U.S. labor market for a decade. That's a scary one. Here's one of my former colleagues at UCLA. Make no mistake, this has morphed into a depression-like crisis. I so wish I could take that economist, put him in a time machine, fire him back to 1931 America, let him see what a real depression looks like before he's tossing around such a terminology so casually. But that's the world we live in, right? Here's probably a better vision of the U camp, if you will. This is the Congressional Budget Office forecast. And let me explain what this is. This is an output gap prediction. It's a little bit different. You might typically see GDP in terms of, growth rates. What this is the difference between what the US economy could produce and what it is actually producing. Go back, for example, to the Great Recession. The Great Recession, worst downturn since World War II, was 6 quarters in length, about a 6% decline in economic activity. But that really doesn't define the pain that the US experienced through the Great Recession. Rather, what you could talk about is how long it took for the US economy to get back to normality. That was an additional 7 years. You could see that output gap stayed in the system really right up until about 2015, 2016. It was a long, painful recovery. Now, contrast that to the very mild tech recession, which was about 4 years, 3 quarters of the recession, about 2 years of a mild output gap, very quickly back to normality. You can see the difference there and how much more painful, obviously, the Great Recession was. The CBO this time is talking about a very similar sort of circumstance, 7 years to get back to normal levels of economic activity. Now, why would they say that? Why? I mean, I get it. A lot of people's models were telling them these dismal things. But as already noted, when economists sit down and they use these forecast models, these fancy vector autoregression models, they have to appreciate that the main assumption is that all business cycles are functionally the same. Well, this one is completely different. Those models will not work. And if you just dumbly run your model, you come up with really dumb answers like this. And of course, a little bit of this is simply the general fighting the last war. You know, there's the old expression, the general always fights the last war. And, you know, I remember in 2007, 2008, everybody's like, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about real estate. Why? The Fed's got this figured out. It's no big deal. Last couple of recessions are mild. This one will be too. We've conquered the business cycle. And of course, didn't happen, right? This time around, everybody's going to say this is the worst downturn ever. Again, why? Just because the last one was bad doesn't mean this one is. Look, every recession, the pain of that recession, the time it takes to get back to normality is critically dependent on what causes that recession. And that, of course, was really where I start having problems with a lot of these folks who compare what's going on right now to the Great Recession, the Great Depression. Look, the Great Recession and the Great Depression were the worst business cycles in the last 100 years in the United States. Why? Well, because they both started from a same position. They both started as a result of the collapse of massive financial bubbles that dominated the economy in the preceding 4 or 5 years. Go back to, for example, the Great Recession. It didn't just come out of the blue the way this one did. It built up for years during that subprime lending bubble that dominated the early parts of last decade. You remember that? $15 trillion of bad money being poured into the US economy through one of the greatest financial frauds in the history of the globe. Amazing, right? You think back on it. Somehow or other, Wall Street convinced regulators and investors that you could lend tons of money to people who have no ability to pay it back, shove it all into an asset-backed security and turn it into gold-plated securities. It almost boggles the mind that we bought into that, but that's the world we lived in. Now, here's the key. When you shove $15 trillion of bad debt into the economy, it has an impact on the real world. Obviously, the housing markets we all know about. Housing markets were the biggest bubble we've ever seen in terms of prices and borrowing and sales and all sorts of crazy stuff. But it wasn't just housing. The commercial real estate industry was similarly inflated. And perhaps the scariest thing of all, people don't talk about too much, is the fact that consumers responded to all this false wealth by simply saying, hey, saving, that's something grandma had to do. I don't need to worry about saving. And they stopped. You saw savings rates fall to the lowest we've ever seen in the United States, even as, of course, the US began to open up a massive trade deficit. When everything started to fall apart in 2006, by the way, not 2008 when the recession actually began, when the wheels fell off that train in 2006, it was really only a function of time until we went into a very, very nasty downturn with a very slow recovery. After all, we entered that recession with these massive imbalances. Think of the millions of jobs in, say, consumer finance and construction that were created that were never sustainable. All those people had to go out and build new careers in new parts of the economy. That takes years. We ended up entering the Great Recession with a vast, too large stock of homes, with way too many durable goods. Huge problems for those particular sectors. Households had tons of debt they had to pay off when all that false wealth disappeared. And of course, the financial markets themselves took years to dig out of all the bad debt that they created for themselves. Long, painful recovery. Now, contrast that to where this situation we're in right now. And again, where we appreciate that this thing has had tremendous social consequences. From an economic perspective, it isn't anything quite like the collapse of a massive financial bubble. It's very transitory, and it hit an economy that actually was in really good shape, probably fundamentally the healthiest it's been in 30 years. Now, it isn't harmless to the economy. While the economy is closed down for 6, 7, 8 months, businesses can't make money, people can't make money, problems start to build in the economy. But as opposed to a recession being caused by massive amounts of problems ahead of time, this is an economy that was fundamentally healthy, got hit by what you might think best as being a kind of a global national disaster, a global natural disaster, a transitory hit. And while the economy is closed, you see some harm start to build up, and that harm will slow the recovery down. But we said right from the get-go, you can't use your models don't work. Instead, you ask these basic questions. How healthy was the economy? How much was actually closed? What has the government done? You had to answer these questions. The answer is this thing's going to bounce back. Now, of course, the most important question was how healthy was the economy in the first place? Well, as noted, very. Take, for example, the labor markets. Yeah, we saw slowing job growth, but the biggest problem in the US economy prior to the pandemic was labor shortages. You know, it's funny that we live in a world where you continue to have a lot of political leaders from the local to the national level talk about the idea that we don't have enough jobs in the United States. Well, for the last 2.5 years prior to the pandemic, there were more job openings in the US than there were people looking for work. We had a labor scarcity problem, not a labor jobs problem. And of course, because of those tight labor markets, incomes were going up. I know. You've heard the exact opposite over and over and over again, based on one bad number that comes out of the current population survey that I wish the Bureau of Labor Statistics would finally, for once and all, just dump, because it's a bad number. It doesn't tell anybody. The Atlanta Fed guys know this. They have something called the wage tracker where they fix the wage rate and the CPS. And their data, again, suggests that both median and average wages were growing at a very solid basis for the last 5 or 6 years. And even better news, people were actually saving their money. Take a look at the left-hand side. You can see the big diminishment in savings rates starting really the early 1990s, of course, falling to the lowest level ever prior to the Great Recession. Well, before the pandemic, savings rates had gotten back up to the highest they've been since the early 1990s. Again, people weren't borrowing much at all. I was amazed by all those hedge fund billionaires getting on CNBC at the beginning of this thing and screaming financial Armageddon, right? Why? It's not the Great Recession. You know, we went into the Great Recession with the highest financial obligations ratio we've ever seen. That's the percent of household income being spent on current financial obligations. We went into the pandemic with the lowest we've ever seen. And by the way, it isn't low just because of high income households. Indeed, look on the left-hand side. This is the ratio of debt payments to family income. And actually, you can see the bottom 40% of households by income had seen the greatest diminishment of their debt burdens coming into the pandemic. This was a pretty solid economy, all said and done. Not an economy that didn't have issues. Of course it did. We can always do better. We should be working to, but it was a pretty good place. And indeed, you think about those financial markets. You know, if you look at when the problems in lending markets began, when you think about those delinquency rates that led, of course, to the banking system being pushed to the edge, those didn't start in 2008, the beginning of the Great Recession. They began in 2006. Indeed, in late 2006, early 2007, when I was making my calls of the Great Recession, I wasn't making it on the basis of some crystal ball. You could already see the wheels falling off the train if you were willing to look. Coming into the pandemic, these delinquency rates were the lowest they have ever been in many cases. So yeah, this was not a market that was going to get hit. California, we'd seen even greater slowing job growth than the US overall. But again, our issues, labor shortages times 5. State labor force growth for the last decade has been running less than 1%. Most of the state had a record low unemployment rate. Just not enough people. Why not enough people? Not enough housing. Not housing affordability. Oh, but God, I've been having this fight for years now. Look, if you want to think about housing affordability in the state of California, take a look at income to rent ratio. I'm sorry, rent to income ratios or rent to mortgage payment ratios. Mortgage payment to income ratios. Those have not been rising in the state. We don't have an affordability problem. We have a supply problem. And of course, when you have a supply problem, basically homes go to the highest bidder. And we have very high bidders in the state because of all the high income sectors that drive our economy forward. Take a look at housing stock, housing units per capita, overcrowded housing, housing vacancy. Everything says we have a massive housing shortage. You build more housing, more people will move here, and you'll have more people available to work in various California industries. It's a supply problem. And indeed, we just got some 2019 numbers, and it shows the exodus of people leaving California has become that much more intense because there's simply no place to live. Now, with that as a backdrop, where are we at this point in time? Well, we recently got the Q3 numbers, and you probably heard the worst quarter in economic history was followed by the best quarter in economic history. Now, it isn't to say we're all the way back. We're still a little bit behind the curve, as the case may be. But take a look at the left-hand side. This is an estimate of monthly GDP. It's relatively easy to build an estimate of monthly GDP using various indicators we have available to us on a monthly basis. And again, you can see the February, the little bump up, the big collapse by April. By May, the economy was already growing, and you can see how much we've come back. We're really 80% of the way back at this particular point in time. Big consumer cycle, big down and then up again. On the right-hand side, gives you a little sense of where we are now relative to where we should be. For example, I'm sorry, where we were a year ago, or pre-recession, excuse me. So GDP, for example, about 3.5% below where it was in Q4 of last year. Most of the way back, but not all the way back. If you look at it from just September, it's a little less. It's a little less than that. It's about, we're really about 4% off trend once you put in the basic 2% trend. Consumer spending about 3.3%. Interestingly enough, if you look at, for example, fixed investments, it's structures that are way down, 14% down overall. But equipment has come back quite a bit. Intellectual property down just a little bit. Residential's up. How about that for a head jerk, right? I mean, after all, we know housing markets are supposed to collapse in a downturn, but this isn't a typical downturn. The numbers are pretty clear. Trade still being influenced, obviously, because the global situation is still pretty intense, and government's about net at this particular point in time. Now, the way to think about this, and this is what I kind of want to walk you through here. If you want to think about where the economy is, let's go through the what I would call the different stages of this thing. First was the recession itself, and as already noted, that ended in April. This was driven by panic, health mandates, so on and so forth. Big pullback in consumer spending because people didn't understand what was going on. But once people figured out what was going on, what the true risks were, how you navigate this, how you live your life, well, that's when things began to turn around. I like to say that recovery, remember, it took 7.5 years for the US to recover from the Great Recession. The recovery this time can be divided into 3 parts. Stage 1 is learning to live with COVID. And this, again, is one of the big mistakes out there in the forecasting world. There was this idea that somehow other people wouldn't try and mitigate. Of course they try to mitigate. People always try to mitigate. Look, you're handed a difficult situation. You make the as best do as possible. And we did a lot of learning. We're still doing a lot of learning. I mean, think of it. We're right now in the midst of a third surge of this in this really tough, stubborn disease. And yet there's no downturn at all in economic activity. You simply slowed things down a little bit. It tells you how much we've done to adapt to this situation. And this is 80% of the recovery. This is where we are. So I'm going to give us a big check. Let's all give ourselves a pat in the back for figuring out how to operate our businesses and live our lives, even in the midst of this crazy situation. Stage 2 on that is containing the disease. Well, no, we haven't done that yet. That's a big X. And I know it's, if you listen to the rhetoric, it's all because, well, Trump is doing a terrible job. Now, I'm not going to dive into the politics of Trump and Biden and who should have done what and this kind of stuff, but I will point out this. Look, at the beginning of this thing, everybody pointed at Europe and said, look what a great job Europe's doing. Why can't we do that too? And right now, Europe has a much worse second surge than the United States is dealing with. Much worse, significantly worse. So I think the point here is to recognize that shutting the economy down is not exactly the right answer. Not doing anything, that's not the right answer either. It's something in between. We never have been able to find that sweet spot. And of course, as a result of that, we're still struggling to get rid of this thing. The third stage is once we get control of the virus, which is obviously isn't going to happen until next year at some point in time, is the return to normality, right? It's that last little bit. And this, again, can take a very long time, depending on the depth of the damage. Well, here, I'm going to give us a check and an X. First of all, I'm giving us a big check because it's going to be relatively short return to normalcy because of the stimulus plans. Now, I appreciate that there are a lot of people out there screaming, we need a second stimulus. We need a second stimulus. We don't need a second stimulus. The first one hasn't worked yet. Let's give a chance for the first one to work yet, and you'll see how well the stimulus plans, how good these stimulus plans are, how large they are. They're not good, how large they are, and how it will get us back to normality quickly. The big problem is it's been so excessive, it's been so over the top that, again, it's leaving us with the potential for inflation not to mention a big federal debt problem. So what caused the downturn? What caused us to come back? Well, consumers. Consumers, of course, panicked at the beginning of this thing. Their spending has come roaring back like nobody's business. What's driving the recovery? And it's, again, go back to the idea about changing how you live your life. Take a look at the left-hand side. I'm breaking this down into goods and services. Services, of course, are where hotels and restaurants sit, and healthcare. Obviously, these parts of the economy have not come back, but people are figuring out that they're going to do something, right? And of course, what they're doing is, while they're not spending money on hotels and restaurants, they are spending it on goods. You know, well, hey, I can't take that trip to Disneyland, so I'll buy the family a camper. By the way, taking a family of 6 to Disneyland costs about as much as a trailer does nowadays. So it kind of makes sense. Take a look at the right-hand side. You can see a breakdown there. Thank you, someone, for laughing at my joke. It's so hard to do a joke on Zoom, but anyway, moving aside. You can see on the right-hand side, September, December, September change numbers for retail sales. And winners and losers. That's the way to think about this. The big winner, non-store retailers, right? Internet sales are through the roof. They're gobbling up massive amounts of market share. And what history tells us is that when Jeff Bezos gets a new client, he doesn't let go of that client very easy. This is a big deal. Not that the pandemic has caused a big problem in retail, the internet has, but the pandemic is accelerating that issue. And the state really needs to figure out what to do with this excess supply of retail. Beyond that, hardware through the roof, sports hobbies through the roof, cars doing great, food, beverage stores obviously up. The losers, gas stations, we're not driving much, restaurants and bars for obvious reasons, and clothing stores. People are buying everything online. And besides, who needs clothes when you only have to dress from the waist up in a Zoom world? So again, winners and losers across the board. But it's amazing how this thing has rippled through the economy. Here's some leading indicators about economic activity. You can see the manufacturing inventory to sales ratio, first way up, now back down to normal territory. Manufacturing is getting back up and running. Retail sales inventory to sales ratio, crazy. Way up and then way down. Retailers got caught completely flat-footed, had no idea spending was going to come back. Again, this is good. It's going to cause a lot of parts of the economy, some of that supply chain, to rush to catch up. Non-defense, non-airline durable goods orders doing fine. Yeah, airlines are getting crushed, but the rest of the system's doing pretty well right now. With all this happening, you can see trade bouncing back. Imports way more than exports. Again, the global situation out there is still having a big problem. You look at Europe, you look at other parts of the world that are still struggling with this thing. So exports aren't doing great, but imports back up to where they were. Look down at the Port of Long Beach and LA. Very busy right now. Industrial production came back up as well. One of the big surprises, of course, out there has to do with housing. We heard all sorts of dismal predictions about how we were going to have this massive housing crisis and tons of foreclosures. Again, didn't make any sense. Why would you say that? Well, it happened last time. That's not how you forecast. Last time we entered the Great Recession with a housing market that was massively distorted by the massive amount of subprime lending that had gone on. This time we came into it, if anything, with a market that was a little bit weak rather than excessively strong. And of course, since then, fundamentals being there, interest rates dropping, people having more money than they know what to do with because of all the stimulus plans, and the housing market is absolutely taking off. Sales are up, new home sales are up, home prices are reaccelerating. Anybody who thought you were going to sit back and buy that house you had your eye on for a 20% discount, not going to happen. Home sales in the state have bounced back. Indeed, month supply of inventory has shrunk to the lowest it's been since pre-Great Recession. This is a very tight housing market right now. Tremendous amount of demand out there. And you can see the median prices across the board going up very sharply at this particular point in time. Now, if you look at the national level, you can see housing starts for single family have bopped up quite a bit. Indeed, they're the highest they've been since really the big slowdown that began prior to the Great Recession. Multifamily housing starts, however, not so well. Those are cooling off a bit. And again, if you take a look at residential permits, you'll see something very similar here. A little bit of a slowdown in overall permits, but single family up, multifamily down across the board. What's going on in the multifamily space? Well, look, there's little doubt that there's been a little softening in the market. Take, for example, this is cost of asking rents. This is restated coming into the third quarter. It has cooled off a little bit. particularly up in the Bay Area, as the case may be. But one of the questions is why. It isn't necessarily the case that you're seeing explosion of vacancies. It's not a supply problem. It's just really more what I call a basic, more of a liquidity problem, right? You have a bunch of apartment buildings coming online. People aren't really moving right now. You're worried about the economy going someplace, and asking rents are softening. To me, this is completely transitory. A long-run apartment hit happens when you have a problem with an excess supply. There is no excess supply out there at this particular point in time. This is, again, the breakdown between single-family, multifamily, some of the different counties. Again, you can see single-family doing fine, multifamily weak. As for the non-residential markets, here too, pretty big change in things, although, again, relative to the Great Recession, not quite as dramatic. You can see the huge downturn there. This time around, it's fallen a bit, but not very much. And I'm not too surprised about it. Unlike the Great Recession, which again, see that huge run up in overall spending on real investment in structures, and then the big collapse afterwards. That's the bubble, right? Classic bubble. This time around, it's been a very, very moderate cycle. Indeed, I wish I had broken out. I have another graph I forgot to throw in here that breaks down the gap between what I would call commercial versus the other forms of structures. And commercial was very, very mild this time around. It's really other structures, manufacturing, mining, exploration, things like that, that were the big surge. So, and when you think about what happened in terms of just the last couple quarters of downturn, you can see on the right-hand side of where the market is from pre-pandemic, down about 15%. But again, interestingly enough, commercial and healthcare only down by about 3.7%. This, of course, is overall investment in current structures. Power communication flat, manufacturing down about 10%. It's really mining that's way, way down. Now, mind you, there was already had a big problem in mining. We had massive glut of oil. Not a big surprise that market has been absolutely hammered by this situation. So probably not as bad as it seems on the surface. It is, though, however, the case that banks obviously are very nervous about what's going on. Banks have tightened their standards for commercial real estate loans, and overall lending has slowed down a bit. Getting a little bit of a breakdown of some of the submarkets across, this is in Southern California for the most part. Again, you can see rents have slowed a bit. Vacancy rates, well, they are coming up a bit. For example, in San Francisco, they're up 1%, San Diego up 0.7%. So there does seem to be a bit of issue here. People are saying, we're not going to renew our space. We're not sure where things are going. A little bit quick, to be honest with you. I'm surprised how much the office market has turned. As for, of course, retail, well, that's just a disaster in the making. Will continue to be for a while because of the internet. There's a lot of questions here about how to deal with the retail space going on. Non-residential permits have been falling. Maybe not quite as bad as you might think, but they have been coming down just a little bit. Although a little better over the course of the summer. Here's some better numbers looking at kind of a year-over-year situation. So they are down a bit, but again, overall, the numbers are probably not bad as you might think. More importantly, of course, again, getting into some of the financial indicators, are we seeing massive signs of the problems in the economy? No. Other consumer debt, actually in the second quarter, delinquency rates went down, not up. And it's worth noting that all this stuff has been happening despite the fact that we are now in the midst of yet again our third surge. I needed to update this graph. I apologize for not doing that. But right now, the United States, of course, is dealing with more cases per million people than we did back in April. I'm sorry, in August of this particular year. Obviously, the European United Kingdom are dealing with a tough situation. Worth noting, deaths are not doing the same thing in the United States. While we have a lot more cases, it is not translating as much into hospitalizations and deaths. This is good news. Now, there's two parts to this. One is, at some level, we learn medically how to deal with this. And the second thing is, remember, with widespread testing, you have a lot of people getting tested, even if they're asymptomatic. And yeah, you may test positive for it. You're not really feeling anything. Obviously, that's a case that you might not have caught in August or in March, but and it nevertheless probably should have been added in those totals back then. State by state situation, you can see the picture here. One of the things I try to say is when I talk about this, I always talk about in terms of surges, not waves. A second wave is when the virus shows up someplace it has already been intensely. A second wave will occur when New York or New Jersey gets hit again. They haven't. For the most part, they're not having a big problem. The wave over the summer, for example, was largely California, Texas, Florida, Arizona getting hit. And now the third wave we're dealing with is places like Wisconsin and Iowa, places that, again, haven't been hit. Obviously, we could have a second wave, but we haven't seen it yet. We'll have to wait and see on that. Again, very similar picture in terms of deaths. The death situation is nowhere near as acute as it was earlier on in this situation. And here in California, a little bit of quick update. We're doing better than the US overall in terms of both hospitalizations and new cases per capita. So still dealing with it, but again, we're definitely on the backside of it. Most important thing, of course, is remember the first time this hit, the economy imploded. Second time and the third time, that all you can say is that the economy, the recovery simply slowed down a bit. Completely different reaction function, not nearly discussed enough in the press. We're learning to deal with it. But let's go back to that gap, the 3% gap. You're not going to get that gap closed no matter how much mitigation goes on, because there are some sectors that simply cannot operate at full capacity until the virus is fully under control. Here's three of them right here. You have, of course, the big three: restaurants, hotels, transportation, entertainment, recreation. By the way, this data is from Opportunity Insights. For those of you who haven't actually kind of watched that, I looked at that website, take a look at it. It's very cool. It's high frequency data based, I think, pretty much on credit card records. It's very interesting stuff, very interesting stuff. These sectors are waiting for the virus to be brought under control to be able to fully recover. We're not there yet. Now, again, you got to be real careful. For example, talk about hotels. So winners and losers. Yes, overall occupancy rates are still way down, but winners and losers, well, some level. If you're a fly-in hotel, think Anaheim, those hotels that are next to Disneyland, they're wait conventions, they're empty. They may not even be open, I'm not sure. However, you go down to, say, Dana Point to stay in Orange County, what you'll see is every hotel in Dana Point has been absolutely packed. Why? Because people want to get out of the house. So if you're a drive-up hotel, you're doing fine. If you're a fly-in hotel, you are dead. Very interesting situation at this point in time. Here's a little bit of more of a breakdown. Probably the biggest lagging indicator of all, obviously, jobs. Now, that has traditionally been the case. This time around, employment is a very, very different kind of feel to it. Indeed, I would say this time around it is both leading and lagging. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, take a look at the right-hand side. This is the unemployment rate. I didn't get, by the way, this morning's unemployment rate numbers. They're now down below 7% overall. But that's still pretty high. Remember, we started this thing 3.5%. We started by seeing the unemployment rate shoot up to almost 15%. Typically, unemployment peaks after recessions are over. Now, this time around, it actually peaked in the same month the recession was basically ending in April. And since then, it's been falling. Why? Why has it been falling so rapidly? Well, let's divide unemployment into two types. Those who are on temporary layoff versus those who have truly lost their jobs. Those who are on temporary layoff, well, those folks dominated the first wave of this thing, almost up to 12%. We've never seen that. In fact, the share of US labor market on temporary layoff has never exceeded 2%. It went to 12% briefly. It is now way down. Those who are truly unemployed, who don't have job prospects out there, well, that is up a bit, but right now running a little less than 5%. Context, Great Recession, that was 9%. Tech recession, it was 5.3%. So what this says is this incredibly large transitory shock to the US system, which we're still working through, has led to what you would call a very mild underlying recession. That's what we're seeing in the US economy today. Again, remember what that means. That means a rapid recovery because it's a mild recession underneath the huge transitory shock. You come into Los Angeles, for example, take a look at where LA is specifically. You can see how we're still down about 9.6%. This is as of September. You can see on the right-hand side, the other counties. Again, everybody's bouncing back, although only halfway back from a payroll job perspective. Where are the big losses? Well, most of them in LA County, for example, leisure and hospitality. It's restaurants and hotels, simple as that. And then you have other services, that's, barbers and hair salons. Information, the movie industry is taking a big hit. And of course, government, a lot of that is education jobs that aren't being brought on because kids aren't going to school. Now, what about this idea of the K-shaped recovery? Been hearing a lot about that. Well, look, at some level, every recovery is K-shaped because we know that low-skilled folks always seem to have the worst employment problems through business cycles. They always do. This time around is no exception. But the idea that somehow or other low-skilled folks are not seeing their job prospects coming back is false. Indeed, the unemployment rate for those without a high school degree shot up above 20% after being at about 5%. It is now back to about, I haven't updated this for today, but probably I'm guessing back to about 10%. And if you look at the right-hand side, job postings, interestingly enough, job postings for low-skilled folks is actually back where it was pre-pandemic. The big gap in job postings is for high-skilled folks. So the problem you have here is a group of low-skilled workers, mainly those who work in hotels and restaurants, and a group of skilled workers who are trying to get their first job, ergo, in other words, people re-entering or college graduates. That is where the pain exists in our labor markets today. It's not all on low-skilled folks. That's simply not the case. More intriguing, of course, again, give you a little more context for these labor markets and what they look like. Take a look at the left-hand side. This is a job openings rate, and I'm still trying to decompose this one to figure out what's going on in here. Believe it or not, the job openings rate is almost back to where it was pre-pandemic, which it doesn't seem what you would expect. But remember, large parts of the economy are doing just fine. We entered this with a labor shortage problem, and as a result of that, job openings are again bouncing back quite nicely. Unlike, say, for example, in the Great Recession, where the job opening rate didn't hit the pre-Great Recession level until almost 8 years later. Completely different kind of business cycle. Now, I appreciate that a lot of small businesses aren't reopening, but again, remember, small business is always a very volatile part of the economy. They're always coming and going rapidly. It's just the nature of things. It's a tremendous amount every quarter of companies both being created and being lost. And this time around is excessively so. Now, here's the key. When you think about what a lot of small businesses say, for example, even small retail or small restaurants, their big problem is what I call the fixed cost problem. Look, take a restaurant that was very profitable in December 2019. Look, there's no reason they wouldn't be profitable in December 2020. However, they have 6 or 7 months of backlog of rent that they don't know how to pay because they were closed. They didn't make any money. Now, if the landlord's smart, they'll cut them a break, right? You'll figure one way out because you'd rather have a successful restaurant than an empty hole in your shopping plaza. But we understand, of course, that these negotiations are tough. In a lot of ways, it may fail completely. And yeah, you have a lot of companies that simply saying, I'm not going to reopen. But it doesn't mean the entrepreneurs who own those companies have walked away, that they're not going to work. They are. Take a look at California business applications. This data comes from the census, and I've never seen anything like it. Even as we're hearing about record numbers of small businesses closing, we're also seeing record number of high propensity business applications in the state, indeed across the United States. So massive turnover, a massive number of new jobs are beginning right behind the businesses that have closed. All this suggests, yet again, a relatively rapid recovery. Now, when do we get over this thing? When do we finally get control over the virus? Well, I don't have an answer for that. I will tell you, watching this thing come and go, it behaves in ways that I don't see data behave. I'm a great forecaster when it comes to macroeconomic variables. When it comes to pandemics, I don't have a lot of experience. But just kind of thinking through one of the things and the fact that we haven't had a true second wave, what it does bring me to realize is that in a lot of ways, we're not even talking about this pandemic correctly. Look, the pandemic is kind of like a forest fire. You can't stop a forest fire. You just can't. Once it gets going, you don't have enough resources to stop a forest fire in its path. What do? You have to let the thing burn itself out. Now that can be dangerous because we know there are people, there are houses, there are livestock in the path of that forest fire. So what do? You deploy your resources to protect the vulnerable while you let the thing burn out. And here, gets the idea that, you know, if you want this thing to burn out, you have to basically have a certain amount of the population have some degree of immunity to it. Now, I understand the term herd immunity has been maligned in a lot of corners. And indeed, I would argue that the entire concept of herd immunity has been largely misinterpreted. It's not as if this virus is incredibly dangerous until you hit herd immunity. Herd immunity is the point at which this virus can't spread at all. You don't need to go there. You need to have it to the point where the thing simply can't spread as rapidly. And the idea here is as a higher percentage of your population has been exposed to this thing, obviously, the less ability this thing has to spread. And while it is true that, you know, there are a lot of people who would say everybody is potentially threatened by this, the data says something quite different, which is the mortality rate seems to be somewhere above 0.5%. And that is mainly for older folks. We need to accept the idea here at some level that unless we come up with a vaccine, which doesn't like us coming anytime in the near future, you kind of want this thing to work its way through the non-vulnerable population. That is to say, younger folks for the most part, while again, you protect those who are vulnerable, those who are health compromised, and of course, older people. And you can see on the right-hand side, the vast majority of people who passed from this thing are older. At some level, we almost have to have that same kind of approach. You can't stop it in its track. We saw that they tried to do that in Europe. It didn't work. You can't ignore it completely. They tried that in New York, and look at the pain it created. You got to find that in between. And I realize it's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of folks, but it's a conversation we have to have. But what I do know is we will get through this at some point in 2021, hopefully closer to the beginning than the end. And then comes the last stage of the recovery, the return to normalcy. Now, how fast does this come? Well, the answer is very rapid because of the stimulus packages. And I'm amazed. Again, you have lots of people talking that we desperately need a second stimulus package, to which I say, we need to let the first one happen first. Remember what they did. For the most part, while some of the money went to places it was immediately needed, for the most part, most of the money they put out there wasn't needed. You gave a bunch of people money to go out and spend when the problem in our economy is people can't spend money. It's not how you stimulate things. You're pushing on a string. Now, the sheer size of the stimulus packages I've never seen like over $3 trillion in stimulus hit the U.S. economy in the second quarter of the year. Incredible amount of money, incredible amount. And it wasn't just, of course, Congress. The Federal Reserve got involved with a massive quantitative easing expert. Now, again, you put tons of money in the economy, where does it go? Well, the answer is, goes into the banking system. How big was the stimulus package? Well, we tracked down some of the numbers. For every dollar of lost earned income in American households, the federal government put back $2, 2 for 1. One of the weirdest things I've ever seen in my life. Here we are in this incredible pandemic, big slowdown in the economy, and personal income, which is usually falling in a downturn, actually grew faster because government put so much money in. Now, again, people don't have any place to spend this money. So what are they doing with it? They're putting it in the bank. $2.5 trillion in excess commercial bank deposits is the start of this thing. 2.5 trillion. As if 80% of the money put into the economy through the stimulus plans just went straight into the banks. By the way, of that amount, over half of it is excess savings on the part of households. There is so much money out there. And when you think about who's behind on spending, take a look at this. This breaks down spending. This is Opportunity Insights yet again between high, medium, and low income families. Low income families are actually spending about 4% more than they were at the beginning of this thing. 4% more. Now, again, I'm not suggesting all households, low income households are doing fine. There are winners and losers. If your primary job was, say, a manager in a kitchen at a restaurant, you're not doing well. If your primary job was being, say, a mid-level manager at Home Depot, you have more hours you know what to do with. So winners and losers. High income households, they're the ones whose spending is down about 7%. Now, again, let's not feel bad for these folks. Understand the money they're not spending is discretionary. They're not going to Disneyland. They're not going to Paris, right? Now, the key here is this. They will spend that money. They will. It's just a function of getting the virus under control. So all that stuff is dry powder. Get the virus under control. That money gets spent. It gets our economy back up and rocking really quickly. You don't have to worry about that last stage. We're ready to go. What you do have to worry about is the federal government that's going to borrow $4 trillion, all said and done. And that's just through the first stimulus package. Remember, $3 trillion for the stimulus, along with the $1 trillion deficit we were already going to run this particular year. They may very well pass a second stimulus next year. What is that, another $1 trillion in deficits? Of course, add in the fact that the economy is still going to be lagging. You could see the federal government borrow over a 2-year period, $5 trillion. You've never seen anything like that before. In 2019, all borrowing, public and private, state, local, federal, consumer, business, all borrowing in the US added up to a little over $3 trillion. In 2 years, the federal government's got to borrow $5 trillion all by themselves. That's a problem. And it's particularly a problem when you realize that we were already hurtling towards a fiscal crisis driven by Medicare and Social Security. We have a big problem out there, but no one's talking about it. We're just spending money as if it's free. You know what one of the legacies of this pandemic is going to be? The fact that we are leaving our children and grandchildren with an embarrassing amount of debt. We are borrowing more as a percent of GDP right now than we did during World War II. Back then, we were fighting a global war against fascism and tyranny. There were people dying on battlefields across the globe. Now, again, I appreciate, my heart goes out to people who have lost loved ones, but really? Does this make sense? Of course not. And then you got the Federal Reserve. And again, since I started the forecasting game 20 years ago, I've been pretty much on the Federal Reserve side. I think they've done a hell of a good job through the Great Recession. This time around, they drank the Kool-Aid and they have just sucked into the morass. I've never seen anything like it. They're acting like this is the Great Recession again. They're quantitative easing like crazy. They push interest rates down to zero. This is not the Great Recession. There are no problems in the lending markets, remember? Look at bank delinquencies, no problems. Financial volatility, that's done. Household wealth collapsed in the midst of the Great Recession. Took years for it to come back up. This time around, it's bounced right back. Housing market's hot. S&P back up. Things are fine. They're acting as if it's a Great Recession financial bubble collapse situation. It's not. There's nothing like it. And this is the thing that makes me absolutely scared. Take a look on the right-hand side. This is M2 growth. 25% year over year. Never seen money supply growth like this, ever. Inflationary? Hell yeah. Now, mind you, it takes a couple of years for inflation to kick in, but the path they're pursuing right now leads us to an inflation crisis in a couple of years. So we don't need another stimulus. What we need to do is back off what we've already done, figure out how to prevent a major fiscal crisis or inflation crisis hitting the US in 2 to 3 years. But again, those conversations aren't being had. And while we're talking about crises, let's talk about California. Remember this $54 billion deficit? That was the punchline our governor came up with in May of this particular year. My question is what budget gap? They're way ahead. They were ahead of schedule last year through the end of last fiscal year. This fiscal year, they're already ahead of schedule. They're doing fine. They get most of their money from income taxes, and most of those income taxes come from high-income earners, and high-income earners are doing just fine. The problem in California is not the state, it's cities. Cities who rely on TOT and sales taxes, cities who rely on utility taxes, and they're not getting their money. Stop focusing on getting more money in Sacramento and start focusing on getting more money in City Hall. That's where the case needs, that's where the money needs to be generated to deal with that problem. Now, what about the long run? What is this thing going to shake out to in the long run? Now, heard a lot about the new normal. We've all heard of the no normal. No, there's no new normal. There's no such thing as a new normal when it comes to epidemics. Epidemics have been with humanity since the dawn of civilization. Shakespeare famously wrote King Lear while he was holed up his house in London hiding from the Black Plague. And when the Black Plague left London, he reopened the Globe Theatre and people flocked in to see King Lear. So no, I don't believe there's a new normal. Now, obviously, some segments are going to lag, or global tourism, older consumers, not a big surprise. For me, the real changes are going to be on the business side. And there's a couple things here to pay attention to. One, of course, is going to be the shakeout in the industries that we're already having a problem. There are too many restaurants, there's too much retail space. These shakeouts are being accelerated. We're going to have to figure out what to do with that empty space. We need to figure out what to do with retail space. And of course, that brings me to what I call the kind of commercial industry outlook. Take the three segments. Let's go retail and industrial and then office. Retail, again, getting hammered. There's a big problem. I think the state needs to figure out right now how to de-retail in this state. I have a very modest suggestion. How about the state pass a law and rezones all retail space in California, mixed use retail residential? Never going to happen, but it's a nice idea. It would certainly solve a lot of problems at one time. Now, what about industrial? Well, it's proven its worth, to say the least. Look, local distribution is all the rage. This is only going to get more so. Industrial is doing just fine. They're bouncing back nicely. Now, office was the one place I got to tell you I was scratching my head. Not sure where this was going, but my personal experience, my personal anecdotal experience is my folks have been working from home since April, and they have done remarkably well. I am amazed by how good productivity is. Now, does that mean I'm going to close my office and be virtual? The answer is absolutely not. We still need an office for collaboration. We still need an office for high training. We need an office to have clients come to. We still need an office. And I don't think it's going to change. And I think it's not going to change when you add on the fact that after working from home for 5 or 6 months, most of my employers are getting ready to chew their arm off, and they're absolutely ready to come back to the office and be social again. But I do think it's worth saying that a lot of offices, a lot of office renters are going to start shrinking their space. Simple as that. Why not, right? You don't need as much space. You're going to let some of your folks work from home more often. It's good for the roads. Yes, it'll probably mean less office space. Now, what does that mean for office demand? What does it mean for office construction? Well, coming into this, I had already observed something kind of interesting in office markets. A lot of the hottest office markets that saw the most new construction were not being driven by falling vacancies. Take, for example, San Francisco, which had double-digit vacancies right through the last 5 or 6 years, even as they were building all those new towers. Why were they building the new towers? Because in our economy of labor shortages, when you're looking for the best and brightest employees, having a cool office space is very important. And as a result of that, you build a new building that has all the new layouts and all the perks and bells and whistles, and companies flock there. So there's still going to be a demand for new office space in those hot kind of economies. It's really about what to do yet again with the old office space. How do we repurpose old office? How do we repurpose old retail? That are going to be big questions everybody has to ask over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. We had to ask it already, but the situation is simply pushing it forward. Now, the election. Well, we're still trying to figure it all out. I don't have a full line on this. Looks as if Biden's going to take the presidency, and the House obviously is going to stay strongly in Democrat hands. We don't know about the Senate. We're going to have 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia. I'm glad I don't live in Georgia for the next 9 weeks. I can't even imagine. I wish I owned a TV station in Georgia. That would be a hell of an investment for the next 9 weeks. Be the best investment you ever made in your life. I can't even imagine the money is going to pour into that state. So there is some uncertainty. Well, let's assume for the second that the Senate stays Republicans. Mitch McConnell, even when he doesn't have a majority, is remarkably good at digging in his heels, creating a firm, if you will, coalition, and just slowing everything down. It almost seems certain that you're not going to see a lot of rapid changes here. The biggest issue for me is a couple months of uncertainty during the Trump to Biden transition. Whether Trump leaves peacefully or in handcuffs, we just don't know. It's a crazy uncertain situation at this point in time. Not good, obviously, for the security of his nation or financial markets. But overall, we're just going to have to work through it. Just uncertainty. As for the state, Prop 15 went down. It seems as if it's gonna fail, for better or for worse. Prop 22, big win, which is interesting because you think about the subcontracting world that was completely upended by AB 5. You talk about the law of unintended consequences, since they only cared about Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft are not out from under it. What are they going to do about AB 5? Remains to be seen. What I will tell you is this: with all the problems this state has with infrastructure, with the desperate need for housing, with fixing our crazy fiscal stimulus. The fact that our state legislators are running around going after Uber and Lyft, that this is their primary issue, to me shows just how far adrift they've come from reality. If you want to look at what these propositions mainly say to me, is that it's pretty clear our state legislative body are significantly left of the population. And there was a lot of repudiation of their politics throughout this proposition. And I hope they wake up and recognize that they need to start pursuing matters that are actually more germane to what I would call the heart of the electorate. Okay, that's probably not going to happen, but we could hope. Rent control, that one's down too. And that one I'm really relieved about. Convincingly blew that one right out of the water. Very surprised. So wrapping it up, we'll get to a little bit of Q&A. Look, this isn't good. It's tragic. Lives lost. Families have suffered. But the economy is fine. Look, natural disasters do not have long-run implications for economies. They never had, and they hadn't this time. The V was the only logical outcome, and that is exactly what's happened. The V has bounced. We've seen the economy bounce back 80%, and the last 20% will depend on how rapidly we get control over this virus. And by the way, that's about behavior, not government policy. Baseline forecasts, as noted, 33% Q3. We're looking at probably a 6 to 7% Q4. Close to full recovery by the middle of next year. I said unemployment below 7% by year end. Guess what? It's already below 7%. Stock market, who knows? But I'm not worried about real estate. Real estate's a long run asset. And for the most part, this isn't a long run situation. Obviously, with the exception that it's accelerating issues in retail. Wild cards, there could be a true second round, global situation, travel's going to lag behind, the government budget situation. None of these things panics me at this point in time. For me, the biggest issue was the issue we had even before the pandemic showed up on our shores, and that was miserabilism. For those of you who haven't seen my talk, miserabilism is the philosophy of pessimism. And what I've seen our economy, our country do over the last 5, 6, 7 years is no matter how good things got, everybody seemed to go out of the way to make it sound terrible. And you know, while I acknowledge that we can always do better than we have, and we should, and there are a lot of people who need a little leg up in the world, at the same time, you have to start on all policy by first acknowledging what's gone right and where things are good. And we didn't. We just sat around creating problems that didn't exist. Take, for example, Uber and Lyft and our state government's frenetic effort to take those guys down. Why? Look, in 2019, we had the tightest labor market in the history of California. We had rising wages, particularly for lower skilled folks. And yet, despite the incredible amount of opportunity for workers in this state, hundreds of thousands of people willingly got in their cars and drove for Uber and Lyft, completely voluntary, completely happily. Obviously, that's not a problem. Why do they spend so much time and effort going after them? I don't know. But I can tell you that inventing problems out of thin air is a bad way to run a state, run a city, or run a country. And that's what we've been doing. And of course, this thing shows up, and look, it's tough, I get it, but it's not what they say it is. The economy isn't being hurt that bad. We just have to get in front of this. But instead of pulling together and as a nation doing our best to get control over the virus, we even let this thing become politicized. We're wearing a mask. Became a symbol of whether you were for Trump or against Trump. For the life of me, what is wrong with our country? That was a depressing note to end on, wasn't it? Anyway, with that in mind, let me go ahead and stop sharing. And we're probably going to have some Q&A. So we got a little time. Fire away. Remember to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll ask a quick question just to get it started. You showed a slide that showed imports and exports, and imports were heading in a good direction. They've been strong. You made a comment that exports were struggling, which in my mind leads me to believe that we have a bigger issue in the manufacturing industry or in the industry in that sector. What does it tell us long term as it relates to our lack of exports?
Well, there's two things going on here, right? There's a long-term structural deficit, and then there's the short-run cyclical situation, right?
Yeah.
The short-run cyclical situation is very clear. The U.S. economy is bouncing back fairly rapidly. The globe is not. Europe's having another mess. They're starting to shut down again. We know that, you know, parts of Asia are having problems still, and just different parts of the globe are having problems. As a result of that, exports are still weak. They're coming back, but not fast, whereas imports are much up because, again, consumer spending is roaring back, particularly on the goods side. So, you know, what that tells me is simply that we're getting over this faster than other economies are, which I think the data supports that as well. In a very real sense, that may be in part because we are a little farther along the path of this virus than other places are. Again, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but you clearly can't stop this virus in its tracks. So you got to learn how to operate with it as a way to do it. And you know, again, that conversation just isn't being had. From a long run perspective, we have a big problem. Now, when I was funny, when back in my days at UCLA, when I was doing my PhD, I was actually a trade economist. And, you know, we learned very early that you don't think about trade deficits as if you will, a trade equilibrium. It's not that everybody else in the world is taking advantage of us. The reason you run a trade deficit is because you are consuming more than we're producing. We don't save enough. And that's been our problem for a long time. We don't save enough. We consume more than we produce. Why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do, of course, with the federal government. The federal government has made promises to us having to do with healthcare and Social Security payments in our retirement years that they don't have the fiscal capacity to actually meet. Now, what that means, of course, for you and I and everybody else in the country, we all need to be thinking towards, boy, when I'm 70 and the government's only going to pay half of my healthcare, who's going to pay the other half? Well, if it's not going to be your kids, you better well have some savings. But again, everybody always thinks it's somebody else's problem, right? That's why we all run around going, hey, 3 trillion in borrowing, 4 trillion in borrowing, who cares? Somebody else's problem. No, it's all our problem. It's our collective problem. We all owe that money. But, you know, we don't think like that as individuals. And so as a result of that, the economy tends to go bad ways. We do need to figure out how to get savings up overall collectively in the United States. We need to start having candid conversations about Medicare and Social Security. But again, how can you have a long run conversation when you can't even have a short run conversation?
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, Dr. Thornburg. My name is Tom Comer. I'm a lecturer at Cal Poly. I try to stay optimistic. I'm usually a glasses half full type of individual. So let me ask you, what business sectors do you see a permanent positive impact because of what has happened?
Well, permanent is a strong word.
Or long lasting?
Well, look, again, I do think retail, again, remember, we already had a problem in retail and this thing is accelerating, right? So that's a sector that we need to figure out. People are buying stuff online. Local distribution is the way it's going to go. Simple as that. And we have too much retail space. See, Europe has far less retail space than we do on a per person basis. Asia has way less retail than we do on a per person basis. We need to de-retail. So that's one sector we need to think about, right? Now, on the other hand, what's going to be up? What's going to be better in the long run? Masks, the mask industry. Can we say that? You know, look, ultimately, you think about, for example, one of the things I think is going to be helpful is, letting people work from home. I think it's going to take some stress off of things. Now, go the opposite direction on that. A lot of folks are talking about, oh, well, downtowns are dead. Downtowns are done. I always love the overtop things. Downtowns are dead. No one's ever going to move downtown again. Why would everybody live in San Francisco? Why would anybody live in downtown LA or downtown New York? And the answer is because of the theaters, the museums, the nightlife, the excitement, the fact that you can walk to the supermarket. There are a lot of reasons that urban areas exist besides the fact that they're close to your job. Again, I get very frustrated with these kind of over-the-top pronouncements. Clearly, if you are one of those commuters living in the East Bay or out in the Inland Empire, your employer lets you work from home a couple days a week. Good. But those folks, particularly younger, who decide to make that decision to live in their shoebox in downtown because they want that urban lifestyle, they're not going anywhere. They're going to move back downtown again. Everybody take a deep breath. Downtowns aren't dead. There's every reason in the world to think downtowns are going to be alive and well once we're through this thing. Again, there's no reason to stay there now. Theaters aren't open. Restaurants aren't open, right? But as for sectors that are up, I don't know. For the most part, I mainly go around trying to blow up miserabilism myths rather than, the upside of things.
I might jump in. Chris,
Sure.
thank you very much for the presentation. It was really informative. You talked about the various market sectors, offices, retail, housing especially. I'm curious if you have any insights into other market sectors like civil infrastructure, utilities, or healthcare.
Well, healthcare is interesting. Okay, I got lots of thoughts. I'm an economist. I have opinions for a living. Let's go through those real quick. Healthcare is not going anywhere, right? I mean, look, people are getting old. We all need healthcare, period. What was interesting was that healthcare is a sector that never cycles. We never had 1/4 of healthcare spending falling through the Great Recession. This time it fell off the map, right? It just collapsed. In fact, 1/3 of the decline in consumer spending that started this thing was healthcare spending. We've never seen anything like it ever. Now, of course, that is not healthcare that is canceled. It's not a discretionary spending sector for the most part. It is simply healthcare that's delayed, and that spending will come back. It's as simple as that. So I'm not worried about healthcare. They're going to be just fine. I am worried about who's going to pay for healthcare and why we pay twice as much as everybody else for mediocre care. But those are broader conversations relative to the trends and where healthcare is heading. Now, the other two sectors were utilities, and what was the last one?
Civil, things like highways and transport.
So utilities again had a big problem. We had excess capacity, big time in electricity, particularly for the public utilities for electricity. Massive excess capacity coming into this. Huge amount of stranded assets. I mean, look at those. Look at the two massive, perfectly functional nuclear power plants in the state, San Onofre and Diablo Canyon, that have just been turned off for no particular reason, right? So yeah, there's a huge problem there. At some point in time, the public utilities are a mess across the board. Something's going to have to shake out eventually. But at the same time, obviously, the other stuff like solar's doing great, still nice and cheap, things like that. And then, of course, last but not least, there was civil engineering, which, of course, is basically infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment is desperately needed. And if you think about it, there's three kind of funders of infrastructure. That's local, states, and feds, okay? States, fine. They're going to continue to do money. Local guys have been falling behind and they're getting hammered now. They're going to have a tough time figuring out how to do this without more sales taxes. Again, we got to deal with that. As for the overall lack of public investment, you can go back to the fact that since the George Bush administration, there has not been one major injection of federal money into public infrastructure. There was a little bit of a surge in the stimulus during the Obama administration, a little bit of one, and it's already way down. We desperately need more federal money coming into infrastructure investments across the United States. Absolutely nothing has happened. 8 years of political infighting, of course, has made sure that's occurred. The only thing I can hope for in terms of this Biden administration is that, look, Biden and McConnell have been working together a long time. Maybe at some level, Biden's going to be able to work with him to get something accomplished on that front. We'll see.
Hi, Dr. Thornburg. My name is John Wu. I'm Construction Management Department Head. Thanks for informative and timely presentation.
My pleasure.
So this year, we had the largest incoming freshman class. We normally had 100 freshmen, this 140. So when I look at your unemployment rate by education, I think it explains a lot. But what do you think of, since we are all kind of coming here to help educate construction education, what do you think about the trend of education, especially related to the construction? Do you think that because of pandemic and because of this different unemployment rate by education, do you think that we will have more people interested in pursuing education rather than going to the industry without college education?
Well, everybody should be interested in education, right? I mean, look, despite all the conversations about rising cost of education, the reality is it's still the best investment you'll make from a long run rate of return. Getting a college degree, particularly a college degree and something that teaches you problem solving, whether it's, you know, engineering or sciences or math, something that teaches you how to solve problems, that will be the best investment you will ever make in your life. And we should be encouraging more and more kids to do that and to do it at good institutions where they have good lessons. I don't think that that's going to go away anywhere. And of course, you think about Cal Poly. I mean, both Cal Polys are just incredibly good investments for the students who can get in there, right? I mean, you just, you know, dollar for dollar, you can't beat it. There's no doubt about it. So I don't think this is going to change that. And, you know, to be clear, you guys are going to be fine because remember the CBO called this a decade-long problem for the labor markets. No, it's not. It's not. Okay. Again, labor markets are going to bounce back. By the time you guys are even getting close to the end of their degree, this thing's going to be ancient history at some level, and they're going to have plenty of job opportunities. Now, thinking about construction specifically, look, the biggest problem in construction over the course of the last few years has been a lack of workers. We know that, right? It's an industry that is beset by major labor shortage problems. That's not going away anytime in the near future. You know, there's two ways of dealing with that. One is to get more people trained, and the other one is to figure out how to use your trained people more efficiently. And that's a management conversation. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of sense, you know, in the world, we think about it, the more and more people we get educated, the fewer and fewer folks you have to carry 2x4s around. Ergo, you better learn how to be smarter in the construction industry. Learning how to do it right is the way to go. Again, I think that's going to be a great skill for these people to have. Labor shortages are a long-run problem that is not going anywhere. Until we build more housing and have an immigration policy that is more accommodative, we're going to have a real problem with placing people in positions over the course of the next decade.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Chris, hi, this is Charlie Mattilla from Morley Builders. Great to see you again, and thank you for the presentation.
My pleasure.
You know, for many of us in the construction industry, we entered this pandemic and the slowdown with a healthy backlog. But when we look at our clients these days, if we think of office construction, they may have been planning an office building, but you know, now they're either because of lenders or others are just hitting pause on that.
Yep.
Is there a perhaps to pick on the phrase of miserabilism, that's a mouthful.
You got it, miserabilism. Yeah.
Yep. Could there be unintended consequences if, you know, the lending markets, if others are not as optimistic, and, you know, could the data change?
Yeah.
Or is there enough behind it?
Yeah. Really good question. And here's the key. Look, there's little doubt that, I mean, look, you go back to April, every real estate deal that could be withdrawn from was withdrawn from, right? There's no way a buyer is going to go through with that buy if they think they can get a better price in 3 weeks, right? So strategically, everybody pulled back like crazy, right? So I'm not surprised at all that there was a downturn in things, right? But with that in mind, and yeah, the problems with the banks as well, remember, they're not seeing any of the financial problems that have been predicted. They just haven't. Take for example, Let's take apartments, for example, right? What's the story? Well, you can't build apartments right now. Why? Yeah, our tenants aren't paying. And so ergo, you can't lend money. These people who own apartment buildings can't pay. Think of all the effort in Sacramento being put on creating various sorts of eviction, moratoriums, right? Now, to be clear, I have never once seen a data point on how many people aren't paying their rent. Not one. Nothing. Now, anecdotally, I've talked to a few people who run management companies that deal with apartments. What do they tell me? A handful of people aren't paying, a couple percent. For the most part, people are having a problem. They talk to the landlord cuts them some slack. We're not seeing any problem. So we have no data. Anecdotally, it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. Yet in Sacramento, their entire world seems to be driven by, what does that sign say? Eviction equals death. The disconnect there is so profound to me, right? That we're just inventing stories. And yeah, you're right. That's bad for the multifamily markets. I mean, again, thank God that rent control thing didn't pass, right? I can't even imagine how these guys are going to think about that. Now, to your point, getting a little closer to home. Look, I get it. Short-run panic, short-run freak out. The Federal Reserve's climbing up every bank's butt right now, telling them to cool their jets. They're all pulling back, making sure. And then what? Nothing's happening. People are paying their mortgages. There's no major problems. There's no uptick in delinquencies. And people are going to realize there is a world after COVID, and they'll get back up to doing things they will. Indeed, I think you're already seeing some of that. You are starting to see some deals go through, things like that. It's still weird, but it's already happening. Again, without any of the commercial real estate is always a lagging indicator on the economy. And the key here is this thing is so intense but so short that it's not really even going to have much of a chance to ripple through the markets in any concrete way. Right now, it's really all about strategic maneuvering, whether it's on the part of politicians or on the part of investors. There's nothing fundamental that's going to make a commercial real estate mess over the next couple of years.
Hi, this is Pat Callahan. To follow up on what you're saying, before the pandemic, we were starting to see the cost of building exceeding what the owners could get for rent or sell the property or rent the property for in obviously the residential side, but obviously in some of the commercial stuff like life science and things like that, it kept going pretty good. And the tech guys kept, renting a lot of space, which obviously they've cooled down on that as well. But that fundamental part of it was already slowing the market down. What do you see changing that fundamental difference between the cost, relative to what they can get on the return?
Well, actually, in 2019, costs were coming down pretty good. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. I mean, most commodity prices were coming down nicely. So wood was coming down, cement was coming down a bit, some copper was coming down. The biggest problem in construction in California has been labor costs, from my perspective. And that, of course, is being driven by lack of labor. And it's just not enough people around. And of course, that plus every time you want to do anything involve the state, they make you use prevailing wages, which are just preposterously high. So, it's, for me, it's always been a labor kind of cost issue, as simple as that. Now, there was a little bit of a slowdown. You're absolutely right in 2019 in some construction. Now, part of that was simply the fact that, particularly in the commercial side, look, when you start running out of workers and job growth slows down, you just don't need as many new buildings. A lot of this is just fundamental. When you have when you have fewer office workers, you don't need as many offices. So the fact that the labor markets would become so constrained, the fact that job growth has slowed, to me, was being reflected in a bit of a slowdown in the overall market for constructing new commercial real estate. That's a market that works. I didn't see any major fundamental problems. I just saw the reality of labor shortages.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
think we have time for one more if somebody wants to jump in.
Make it a good one. You guys got some great backgrounds in here, by the way. I'm enjoying some of these, the backdrops we have up in front here.
Makes you get ready to go on vacation again after COVID.
It
right?
does. It does. Yeah. Absolutely.
Come to San Luis Obispo.
Yeah.
I'll jump in real quick. This is Ray Trubino with DPR Construction. One of the topics you didn't touch on was the environment. So just kind of curious if you got any thoughts on that and how that might be affecting the economy.
Yeah. I mean, you mean like the environment, like global warming kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, global warming is a huge issue. I'm totally on board, but I'll tell you, as a macroeconomist, I kind of really worry about the next 3 to 4 years. I like to say the environmental stuff is the next 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50. We need to get in front of it. I leave it to other folks to talk about how to go about doing that for the most part. I think the biggest place you're obviously seeing environmental problems is in the fires we've been dealing with, particularly this year. It was a horrendous fire year. Clearly, we got to learn how to deal with that. It's not going away anytime in the near future. And I almost say it's almost going back to the pandemic type situation. Look, you can't fight these fires. You can't stop these fires. You got to roll with the fires until things kind of re-equilibrate. And what that means is a big, long conversation about land use policy. We need to have less sprawl out in the hinterlands. That's where the problems are. And, you think about a place like, San Luis Obispo or Sonoma. Someone said San Luis Obispo. I do work actually both in SLO and Sonoma. And, when Sonoma had a couple of those horrendous fires, one of the things they put forward was a big plan about how to re-densify Santa Rosa, as opposed to constantly building new suburbs into the hillside where you're going to have risks and problems with fires. Can we not redevelop downtown Santa Rosa, bring people in that kind of more dense urban areas where you don't have to worry about fires and you can still expand your local economy? This is about densification. In fact, the vast majority of problems in California can be fixed with densification. Whether it's better use of more residential units, taking traffic off the highways, making our public transport that much more efficient, densify. We need to do that. And from an environmental standpoint, the thing that makes me most crazy is here we have a government that happily calls itself progressive. And yet here you have what is clearly the best environmental policy, which is promoting densification in urban areas, and they won't do it.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
So, all right, folks, it's been a pleasure. It's been great to meet you. We will have a copy of these slides at beaconecon.com if you'd like to go ahead and download them. And with that, be safe, have a great weekend, and hopefully we won't have a revolution in the next few weeks.
Thank you so much for your time and your insight. Really appreciate it. Good luck with your arm recovery.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
That was wonderful.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks again. That was great.
Take care.
All right, and we'll see everybody at 1:30. We got a lunch break, so you can make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and we'll see you guys in an hour. Or 1 hour, 1:30.
Sounds good.
Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Well, we all missed the lunch in the courtyard of the CM building, right?
Mhm.
All right, thank you. And yeah, it was I like the both sessions. It's really informative for everybody, right?
Yeah. No, I think he's the one that presented before. I recognize him. He's really good.
Okay. Yeah. So afternoon, we will start with the committee reporting and talk about CMAQ budget a little bit, and then department updates. So a lot of my song and dance, and I think that I can control PowerPoint from my side.
Do you want to do that?
Yeah. Okay. No, I don't think so. It's not a good idea. When I speak and the controlling PowerPoint, sometimes it's kind of a